For the latest on today's Twitter revelation, we go to some of the best reporters on the beat at the White House. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell, NBC Intelligence and National Security reporter Ken Dilanian, and Washington Post White House Bureau Chief Philip Rucker. You could all be 4 p.m. co-hosts by now. Thanks so much for being with me again. Philip, I want to start with your piece because this whole exchange over whether he did or did not have recordings is ludicrous at best. But it does raise this serious question, and Adam Schiff touches on it in your piece by saying, was this an effort to intimidate Jim Comey? Was this an effort to silence James Comey? We all know that backfired, but that seems like the piece of the self-inflicted damage that Trump is still paying for.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's important to remember that original tweet in context. He made the tapes announcement on Twitter on May 12th. The night before, May 11th, is when the New York Times reported that explosive story about the one-on-one dinner that Comey had with Trump, which detailed Trump's request of Comey demands for loyalty. And so this seemed to be interpreted at the time as Trump trying to intimidate, to pressure, to threaten Comey about leaking to the press by mentioning the tapes thing, and then it just went on for 5.5 weeks. It was really remarkable. The president and the senior White House officials, including Sean Spicer, refused to tell the public whether or not these tapes existed until we found out today that, of course, they don't.
Of course they don't. Ken Dilanian, you have some new reporting this hour about other men who were pressured to knock down the Russia story. Tell us about it.
Yeah, the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, was before the House Intelligence Committee today, and he repeated the story that's been reported, but he hasn't been willing to say in public, which is that Donald Trump went to him in March repeatedly and asked him to say that he had seen no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Coats told the committee that he felt that the president was obsessed with the Russia investigation, and he found that to be inappropriate. He found the request to be inappropriate. He turned it down, and now we know that it's something that the special counsel Robert Mueller is investigating as part of the obstruction of justice probe.
Kelly O, it all comes back to this White House and how they create crises that then they have to manage. I want to play you a little bit of sound from today's briefing and ask you about all this on the other side.
Why it took so long, 41 days, for this to be laid to rest, and whether the president is recording any Oval Office conversation.
You guys asked for an answer. He gave you one. He said he would have it to you by the end of this week, which he did. And beyond timing of that, I can't really speak anything further.
So, Kelly O, it's obvious from last night's rally and today the president trying to meet his own deadline that he's feeling like taking matters into his own hands is a practice he's clearly operationalizing. But I wonder what you make of the fact that the president tweeted out this answer right before he was facing a congressional deadline to turn over the tapes, and the fact that you had to cover another briefing that wasn't on camera. Pretty extraordinary times to be covering a pretty extraordinary White House.
Well, Nicole, I do believe that the congressional deadline is a powerful force here. The president could have cleared this up instantly in the day after he made the first tweeted assertion. They chose not to do that for whatever reason. And because of that deadline, let me just say that initially the plan for the off-camera gaggle today, which is a shortened form of a briefing, gaggle's just a journalism term of art. It was not to be on camera.
It's supposed to be the warm-up. We should tell. It's supposed to be the
Yes.
warm-up for the on-camera briefing, so they get a sense of where all of you guys, where all of us are in our heads, what stories we're trying to cover. But that's usually all that you guys get these days, right?
Yes, and in this instance, though, they did make it on audio. And I said to colleagues, I wonder if it's because they're going to tell us something that they do want on the record, even if it's not televised. And shortly before the scheduled gaggle briefing, I went looking for someone who could confirm this. They were all conferring. Doors were closed. That's typical for the prep before you would face reporters. But in that intervening time where I was trying to find an open door, that's when the president tweeted. So the fact that he notified his press staff that he was going to put out this tweet suggests that the White House counsel was involved in it. I think the wording did not record, does not possess, means that there wasn't some other staffer that had a recording that he had possession of. That all felt like a carefully planned, proper response, just put out through Twitter that is intended for the House inquiry. And so much of this goes back to, Nicole, the president's impulse to try to nick away at the credibility of someone he perceives as an opponent. We saw crooked Hillary. We saw Lion Ted during the election cycle. And James Comey was someone he was trying to chip at his credibility. So to raise the specter of tapes that might refute his account is something that in that moment seemed like a way for the president to sort of raise doubts about James Comey, and yet it unleashed so many other steps that are certainly more problematic for the White House than if he had just not tweeted about James Comey at all. Nicole?
Phil, thanks. Philip, you brought us back in time, and I think it's useful to remember that there was no special counsel yet when these tweets went out, so that everything that happened after the Twitter taunt that put in motion Comey's middle-of-the-night revelation that he better get out his side of the story, and people are going to judge that move until the end of time. So let's just say that of the two of them, he's still the man who hones closer to the model of a Boy Scout. But they both played in an untraditional kind of way for a top law enforcement official, and certainly for a president. But I wonder if you're picking up from anyone inside or outside the White House in contact with the president, if he feels affirmed in his ways and his methods after the special election results, and if you think that they're going to have a harder time now getting him off Twitter even than before this week.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of White House officials the last couple of days about this very subject, and again and again and again, we're hearing that they're really resigned to the fact that he's going to continue to tweet this way. He likes it; it's his outlet, and that he's going to continue to fight back on the Russia investigation. He approaches this not as a legal matter so much as a political campaign. He's out there to discredit Comey, to discredit the special counsel, to discredit the fake news media, all of us. Who are covering it, and he feels like the Georgia results validate his belief about all of this, which is that the American people, the voters out there in the country who voted for him and still support him, don't care about Russia. He turns on the TV and he sees what he views as hysterical commentary on cable, and he feels like out in the country, nobody's listening to that. Nobody cares about that. They want him to do jobs. They want him to focus on foreign policy, to take out ISIS, do all the things on his agenda that he's not yet done. So for him, it's a challenge, and I think they're going to have a really difficult time prying him away from Twitter, as self-destructive as that may be.
And Ken Dilanian, even if they don't care about Russia out in the country, I understand today from a law enforcement source that Mueller's staff is up to about 30 lawyers. They all sort of meet the very high standard that I think people know Mueller to have met during his entire government career. And now you've got Chuck Grassley, the Republican chair of the Judiciary Committee, saying in a profile in Politico that he's going to run down any questions about whether or not the President of the United States obstructed justice. So the investigation doesn't just continue, but it seems to be intensifying, no?
That's right, Nicole. And those 30 lawyers, don't forget, that's just the legal team. There are supporting them more than 100 FBI agents across the country in various field offices, digging into all sorts of avenues, from, the business relationships of people around Donald Trump to the collusion question to this obstruction of justice matter. So you're absolutely right. It's intensifying. I just wanted to say one thing, too, about this whole tapes issue. If this was a bluff, and it's pretty clear that it was a bluff by Donald Trump, I wonder what the implications are going to be for foreign leaders who are watching this president. What does his word mean? And this is of a piece of, his secret plan, if you recall, during the campaign to defeat ISIS dramatically, which turned out not to be a secret plan or any plan. He's using the Obama plan. The president's credibility matters. And here's an example where he said something that just he later backtracked on and proved not to be true.
Kellyanne, let me just get you really quickly on that question that Ken just raised. I mean, I saw Kellyanne Conway, one of the senior most advisors on that White House staff, with some pretty glib. This team is becoming notorious for being pretty crummy winners. But do they take any of this seriously? Do they worry about what Ken just talked about, how they're perceived by foreign leaders abroad, or is this just who they are? Deal with it.
Well, I think they make a distinction about the personal relationships that the president has with leaders as he is meeting them, and that is something that is more of a face-to-face bond. And they view the Twitter statement flow of the president as something that is much more in his sort of branding, provocative marketing sense, and that they would draw a distinction between the kinds of personal bonds the president has begun to make with specific leaders. If those leaders view it differently, that might be a case-by-case scenario, but they have begun to view his tweet storms or tweet sort of trouble spots as something that can be dealt with and explained away, even though we've just outlined how problematic it can be and how it can trigger a whole series of unwanted consequences. But on the foreign policy piece, this has not yet come into a realm where they have been terrified by a tweet with respect to foreign policy, at least not yet.
All right, the best of the best. Kelly O, Ken Delaney, and Philip Rucker, thank you all so much. Bill Kristol, I saw you nodding.